So real quick, how in the world did we even get here? It all started a couple months ago when I decided that it was finally time for me to go down the Keith Richards rabbit hole. I had had this realization that of all the bands that I hadn't yet taken the time to fully dive into and understand, the Rolling Stones were about as close to the top of the list as you possibly could be. Because outside of recalling a few times when I played Paint It Black on Guitar Hero 3 as a kid, or this random cover that we did when I was playing in this band last year, I don't think off the top of my head I could have named more than maybe 3 Stones songs. And I knew at some point I wanted that to change. But knowing so little about such a gigantic band, I mean, that can feel overwhelming. I mean, we're talking about guys whose discography may or may not consist of 31 studio albums, 13 live albums, and 28 compilation albums. I had literally no clue what I was even supposed to do with all that information, so I decided the smart thing to do would be to just call a friend.
I would say that the Stones are like the quintessential rock band. They are what laid the framework for everything to come, because they started in the early 60s and have been more or less relevant for 60 some years. Yeah. And they have always been, they've kind of been the framework. They've been that thing that all of rock and roll is essentially built upon. You can find so many roots, and so much of what our concept of rock and roll is now is rooted in what the Stones did. So to me, it's just the quintessential rock and roll band. To me, what makes him so great is kind of twofold. It's the composition, because he wrote some of the best riffs, some of the greatest, most iconic riffs ever recorded. And like, that's why he is, in my opinion, one of the greatest guitar players ever. It's not because he was just this flashy, incredible soloist or anything like that. It's because he wrote Satisfaction, Get Off of My Cloud, all these riffs. Like, he's like the ultimate riff writer.
So I'm soaking in all this information from my much wiser friends while I'm taking these constant mental notes, and I can feel my interest growing by the minute. And eventually, if you know me, as you probably could have guessed, we got on the top of gear and I asked him.
Any essential gear that you would say, like, to sound like Keith Richards would be helpful?
The telly is, I think, a pretty big thing for him.
Now, real talk, this was actually one of the things that I knew beforehand, because even someone like me with very little knowledge of the band going in knows that there are very few tellies quite as legendary as Keith Richards' 50s Butterscotch Machine. But as all electric guitar players know, figuring out the guitar is really only one half of the equation. The other part of the equation is figuring out what amp he was using. Now, as expected, Keith used a number of amps over the years. I mean, he was a rock star, from the AC30 to the Fender Twin, but one happened to stick out to me just a little bit more than the rest, and it was a small little amp called the Fender 57 Champ. It was this tiny little tweed amp with just one knob, really not the sort of thing that I'm used to using. Small combo amp, yes, maybe even 2 knobs and an attenuator, but this was about as bare bones as you can possibly get. It reminded me a lot of the Pro Junior that my college roommate used to go on and on about endlessly, but even that had a tone knob on it. So with just how different it is than all the other Fender amps that I've tried before, I decided it was time to check it out. Now, like most guitar players, usually when I get a new piece of gear, I'm just ecstatic about opening it and using it immediately, but for some reason that wasn't really the case with this amp. I was working on a couple different projects that were really exciting to me, so it just ended up sitting on my kitchen floor in the box unopened for weeks and weeks and weeks. That was until one of those projects specifically happened to reveal something very interesting to me. You see, I'd recently started looking into a guy by the name of Johnny Marr, a guy who, much like Keith Richards, I had had about zero experience with his music or his tone. So I was trying to figure out what amp and guitar combo he used, and from the research I was doing, it seemed that one of his bread and butters were the Jaguar into the JC120. But I wanted to confirm that for myself, so I started doing some investigative journalism, and wouldn't you know, Johnny Marr was also a 57 Champ player. And the more I looked into it, so many great players had left their mark with this amp. I mean, I'm talking legendary stuff like Duane Allman recording Layla with Clapton. It was so noteworthy that before I had even taken the time to open it and take it out of the box, I started doing research on the history of the amp, and apparently its beginnings go all the way back to the late 1940s. 1948 to be exact, before Leo had ever released a single guitar into the world, where the Champion 800 was first introduced. Now, that amp was discontinued in 1949 and replaced by the Champion 600, and different alterations were made over the years. And then in 1956, a very big one, because the amp got an 8-inch speaker and was officially named the Champ. And then in 1957, as you probably could have guessed. So as you probably could have guessed, once you actually start playing through an amp like this, there really isn't a lot you can control. There's like this inherent simplicity that does take just a second to get used to, but whether it be because of the volume knob or just the way that you mic it, once you actually find a sound that you like, it's not a very hard thing to recreate. And I can especially see why that would work for someone like a Keith Richards, because you had your guys in the early days, like your Hendrixes and your David Gilmours, who were really on the front lines of this whole pedal revolution, whether Hendrix with his fuzzes, David Gilmour using modulation, but you also had guys like Keith Richards who were like, I like guitar straight into amp, just as simple as that. I think specifically coming from someone like myself who is a Helix user, who does use a lot of ambient tones in the live setting, not that there's anything wrong with that, but a lot of the times I do start to ask myself, like, am I just using these big reverbs to hide whether I can or can't play? But there is something really special about just going back to the basics of guitar into amp, especially once you get into like that rock and roll. Once we start thinking about amps like this in terms of being pedal platforms, that's where I feel like the conversation gets really, really interesting, because in my mind, I feel like I have two schools of thought. And the first one is simplicity, which is actually how I prefer to use an amp like this. I recently discovered absolute virtuoso Julian Lage, who's playing as just chef's kiss, more on that later, but I saw that he was just using a 57 champ with a Traverb, and that's it. And I tried to recreate that sound, and I ended up getting one of the most beautiful clean tones I've ever gotten in my life. And that shouldn't surprise me as much as it does at all, because when you really start to think about it, right, most jazz players have probably built their entire careers on just guitar into one small reverb into amp. Now, if we're looking at the other end of the pedal platform question, specifically if we're talking in the context of overdrive pedals and rooms like this where you can't make unlimited noise, there's a lot less that you have to worry about with stuff like gain staging. Even if we're just talking about amp-in-a-box pedals or any sort of distortion or overdrive pedals that have a lot of different knobs and a lot of different controls, I feel like amp-wise, you're just eliminating a lot of different variables, which in a non-studio setting, I think could be very helpful. So at the end of the day, what did we even learn here today? And I could tell you a lot of different things about how back in the day, probably like a lot of different guitar players, I held all these misconceptions about the higher the amp wattage, the better the amp was going to sound, and you needed to get to exactly this volume to like get the proper amount of breakup. But it's not really about that for me. What I learned had a lot to do with simplicity. And I think it even takes me back to when I was playing with like the JC120. A lot of the times it is really cool to go back to the basics of just guitar into amp, and not even just guitar into amp, but guitar into about as simple of an amp as you can get. It just makes me really start to think, because a lot of the times, even when I'm thinking of guitar players going straight from guitar into amp, I'm like, well, Angus had these big Marshall stacks that could get all these gains and had all these different controls, but then it's like, no, Keith Richards, man, he was just going guitar into like a one-channel amp at times with nothing more than a volume knob, and he sounded amazing because he was a great player. But at the end of the day, I don't think it matters what I think. What matters is what you think. So please let me know. Have you played a 57 champ reissue before? What's your favorite Fender amp of all time? Do you even like some of these really simple amps? Please let me know in the comments. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this video. I've wanted to learn some Rolling Stones stuff for quite a while, and even just getting into it with Sammy G, or just trying to crank this amp in my room, which even at like 5 or 6, I was so scared that my neighbors were gonna call the front office and literally get me evicted. But if you you want to know anything more about this amp right here, I got it from the homies at Sweetwater. The links are in the description. Make sure to check it out. It's one of the best ways to support the channel if that's something you want to do, or if you're just curious about any of the other gear that I use in this video, make sure to check out those links. Also, thank you so much to all my patrons. There's some really cool exclusive stuff on there if you want to join the community. Like and subscribe if you had a good time. Most importantly, most important of all, have a fantastic night.